There is a particular moment every parent knows. A child is crying, or furious, or shaking with a fear that seems to an adult out of all proportion to its cause. The morning is short, the demands are many, and the easiest thing in the world is to make the feeling stop. In Raising an Emotionally Intelligent Child, the psychologist John Gottman argues that this exact moment, repeated 10,000 times across a childhood, is where the whole enterprise of raising a person is quietly decided. What a parent does when feelings run hot matters more, he contends, than almost anything else they do. This is a summary of that book, written by John Gottman with Joan DeClaire, and first published in 1997 under the title The Heart of Parenting. Gottman is not a theorist spinning ideas from an armchair. He is a research psychologist who spent decades watching families in laboratories, wiring children to instruments that measured their heart rates and stress hormones, coding thousands of hours of videotaped interaction. Out of that work came a claim he believes he can prove: that a small set of habits, which he calls emotion coaching, produces children who are healthier, happier, more resilient, and better able to love. What follows traces his argument as he built it, chapter by chapter, from the discovery itself to the way it changes across the whole arc of a childhood. The book carries a promise that is both modest and enormous. Modest because the 5 steps at its heart are simple enough to describe in a sentence. Enormous because Gottman insists these steps do nothing less than shape a child's nervous system, moral character, and capacity for intimacy for the rest of their life. Chapter 1: Emotion Coaching, the key to raising emotionally intelligent kids. Gottman opens with 3 families and 3 ordinary crises: a 3-year-old who collapses on the floor rather than go to daycare, a 7-year-old in tears over an unfamiliar babysitter, a 14-year-old who slams the door after being accused of smoking pot. Different ages, different stakes, one shared problem: what to do with a child when emotions run high. His central claim is that good parenting requires more than intellect and more than love. It requires a specific competence in the domain of emotion, and this competence, he argues, has been almost entirely ignored in the parenting advice of the previous 30 years. The organizing idea is a taxonomy. Gottman divides parents into 2 broad camps and then subdivides one of them. There are parents who get involved with their children's feelings, whom he names emotion coaches, and there are those who do not. Among the non-coaches, he identifies 3 distinct types, and the distinctions matter. The dismissing parent disregards, trivializes, or tries to make negative emotions disappear, often through distraction or a well-meant cookie. The disapproving parent goes further, treating the display of anger or sadness as misbehavior to be reprimanded or punished. The laissez-faire parent accepts and empathizes with every feeling, but offers no guidance and sets no limits, leaving the child adrift in emotion with no map out of it. What unites all 3 is that none teaches the child what to do with what they feel. To make the contrast concrete, Gottman replays the daycare scene through each style, then walks through what the emotion coach does differently in a scripted exchange with little Joshua. The coach begins where the laissez-faire parent begins, with empathy, but does not stop there. She acknowledges the sadness, helps name it, lets the child feel it, stays with him through the tears, and then, crucially, sets the limit. We cannot stay home, but we can look forward to tomorrow. From this scene, he extracts the 5 steps that structure the entire book. The parent becomes aware of the child's emotion, recognizes the emotion as an opportunity for intimacy and teaching, listens empathetically and validates the feeling, helps the child find words to label it, and sets limits while exploring solutions to the problem at hand. The chapter's second half is the evidence, and Gottman is careful to present it as science rather than sentiment. Drawing on longitudinal studies of 119 families followed from age 4 into adolescence, plus a parallel study tracking 130 newlywed couples into parenthood, he reports that emotion-coached children have better physical health, higher academic scores even when controlling for IQ, stronger friendships, fewer behavior problems, and lower levels of stress hormones in their urine. The finding he calls most surprising is resilience. Coached children still get sad and scared, but they recover faster, soothe themselves sooner, and return to productive activity. He introduces the concept of high vagal tone. a measure, named for the vagus nerve, of how well a child's parasympathetic nervous system can put the brakes on arousal. Children with high vagal tone are, in his memorable phrase, autonomic athletes, able to spike in response to stress and then settle quickly. Emotion coaching, he argues, is how that physiological capacity is built. He situates his work within a lineage. The intellectual debt he names most warmly is to Chaim Ginott, the clinician of the 1960s who taught that parents must listen for the feelings behind a child's words, that statements of understanding should precede statements of advice, and that while all feelings are permissible, not all behavior is. Ginott's principles had never been tested empirically. Gottman presents his own contribution as the first quantifiable confirmation that Ginott was right. He also gestures toward Daniel Goleman, whose book Emotional Intelligence gave the field its name, and toward the historical work of Lloyd DeMause, whose bleak account of childhood across the centuries frames the shift toward what DeMause called a helping mode of parenting. Alongside this, Gottman invokes Diana Baumrinn's classic typology of authoritarian, permissive, and authoritative parenting, aligning his coach with Baumrinn's authoritative style: warm, limit-setting, and explanatory. The takeaway here is quietly at odds with a great deal of modern advice. The goal of raising a child is not compliance, and love alone is not enough. What a child needs is to be met, in the moments that matter most, by someone who takes their inner life seriously. Because that inner life is real, and forming it well is the beginning of forming a whole person. Chapter 2. Assessing your parenting style. Having named the 4 styles, Gottman turns the lens on the reader. This chapter is built around a lengthy self-test, 81 true or false items about the parent's own feelings towards sadness and anger, in themselves and in their children, scored to yield a profile across the dismissing, disapproving, laissez-faire, and emotion coaching dimensions. His insistence that the road to becoming a better parent begins with self-examination is not incidental. It is the chapter's spine. Emotion coaching, he stresses, does not flow automatically from loving a child. It is an art with identifiable component skills, and most parents must first clear away obstacles rooted in how emotion was handled in the homes where they themselves grew up. The heart of the chapter is a gallery of portraits drawn from his research interviews that make each style unmistakable. Robert, a devoted father who pampers his daughter Heather, would be startled to hear himself called dismissing. Yet he never confronts her sadness directly, believing that attending to painful feelings is like watering weeds, making them grow. Gottman's most sobering example is the mother of a 7-year-old who died attempting a transcontinental flight. The mother had forbidden her daughter words like scared and fear, insisting children are naturally fearless and that emotion is unnatural and untruthful. The point lands with force. Had the child been permitted her fear, the same fear that kept seasoned pilots grounded in that storm, the tragedy might have been averted. Dismissing, in Gottman's telling, often springs from love and a wish to protect, and from a parent's own fear of being swept away by feeling. The disapproving portraits sharpen the edge. These parents share the dismisser's discomfort, but add judgment and punishment. Gottman quotes fathers who distinguish good reasons from bad reasons for a child's sadness, mothers who read tears as manipulation, parents who treat sadness as a finite commodity, not to be squandered on trivial matters. Save your tears for dead dogs, one father tells his son. He notes how often the harshest responses come from parents who were themselves emotionally neglected, and how spanking and shaming aimed at toughening a child instead teach that emotional intimacy is dangerous. The laissez-faire portraits, by contrast, are gentler but no less cautionary. Parents like Amy, who empathizes deeply with her sad son but then goes for a run, leaving him alone with the very feeling she understands. The chapter closes on the emotion coach, illustrated by parents like Dan and Sandy, who prize their children's negative emotions as chances for closeness, set firm limits on behavior while accepting all feeling, and are unafraid to show their own emotions as models. Here, the takeaway is unmistakable and worth sitting with. The parents who cause the most harm are almost never cruel. They are loving people acting on a mistaken philosophy of emotion, which is precisely why examining one's own philosophy is the necessary first act. Chapter 3. The 5 Key Steps for Emotion Coaching. This is the working core of the book, and Gottman grounds it in a story about himself. On a cross-country flight, his 2-year-old daughter Mariah demanded her stuffed zebra, which was checked in the baggage hold and utterly unreachable. Nothing worked, not explanation, not distraction, not substitute toys, until he stopped trying to fix the problem and simply named her longing. "You wish you had zebra now, and you're angry we can't get him." Within minutes, she was calm and asleep. The lesson he draws is that empathy, not solution, was what she needed, and empathy is the foundation on which all 5 steps rest. Before the steps, Gottman devotes a long passage to imagining childhood in a home without empathy, where a child learns that his sadness is a fly in the ointment, his anger an embarrassment to the clan, and so becomes a master of covering up, steering clear of the intimate bonds that produce conflict. Against this, he sets the home organized around empathetic understanding and illustrates the difference with 2 versions of a father, Bob, responding to his son William's rejection by the neighborhood kids. In the first, Bob lectures the boy to toughen up and get over it. William concludes there is something wrong with him. In the second, Bob simply listens, and William arrives at the very same practical solutions his father might have offered, but owns them and walks away with his self-respect intact. Empathy, Gottman argues, is what allows a child to see a parent as an ally rather than a critic. The 5 steps then unfold in sequence. Step 1, being aware of the child's emotion, requires that parents first be aware of emotion in themselves. He includes a self-test of emotional awareness and a frank discussion of how gender and culture shape expression without changing internal experience. Here he reports one of his more striking findings. Husbands track their wives' minute-by-minute emotions just as accurately as wives track husbands, and men and women experience feeling similarly, even though men more often hide it, meaning most fathers already possess what coaching requires and need only permission to use it. He addresses parents who fear losing control, offering the airplane oxygen metaphor a mother named Sophie used. You must secure your own emotional footing before you can help your child. Step 2. Recognizing the emotion as an opportunity, reframes a child's distress as the moment he needs his parent most, and urges catching feelings while they are low in intensity before they escalate. Step 3. Empathetic listening and validation is the one Gottman calls most important. He illustrates it with an extended patient exchange between a mother and her daughter Megan over being ignored by friends, showing how reflecting back what you hear, rather than arguing the facts or rushing to advice, lets a child feel understood and, only then, receptive. Step 4, helping the child verbally label emotions, rests on his theory that naming a feeling engages the brain's language centers and has a measurable soothing effect on the nervous system. Step 5, setting limits while problem-solving, returns to Ginot's principle that limits belong on acts, not feelings, and lays out a further 5-part process. Set the limit, identify goals, generate solutions, evaluate them against the family's values, and help the child choose. Within this step, Gottman delivers his sustained case against spanking, marshalling evidence that physical punishment stops misbehavior in the short term while teaching aggression, breeding revenge over reflection, and correlating with violence later in life. The steady conviction running beneath the whole chapter is that a child is not a problem to be managed, but a person to be met, and that limit setting works best not through fear, but through the bond that empathy builds. This is a picture of authority grounded in love rather than force, which is exactly the kind of authority that forms rather than merely subdues. Chapter 4. Emotion Coaching Strategies. If Chapter 3 gives the method, Chapter 4 gives the practice. The strategies for when coaching stalls and the situations where it should be set aside. Gottman opens with his firmest prohibition: avoid criticism, humiliation, and mockery. His lab data are unambiguous that contemptuous parenting, repeating a child's words in a sneering tone, cataloging every mistake during the video game task, taking over to demonstrate the child's incompetence, predicts, 3 years on, the children with the most trouble in school and friendship and the highest stress hormones. Against this, he sets scaffolding, the technique he observed coaching parents use. A slow, calm manner, just enough information to start, specific rather than global praise for each small success, then a little more instruction. He likens the coaching voice to Mr. Rogers rather than Sesame Street, measured and gentle rather than flashy, as better suited to teaching a child about feelings. A cluster of strategies addresses the subtler obstacles. Gottman warns against the parental agenda, the preformed goal that prevents a parent from listening. His example is Jean, whose worry that her son plays the victim leads her to answer his hurt with, "Well, are you nice to her?" converting sympathy into blame. He cites Alice Ginott Cohen's counsel to address the feeling before the misdeed, and Christopher Hallowell's aching memory of a father who could never approve of a hand-built box, as a caution about how trait labels, lazy, shy, scatter-brained, become self-fulfilling prophecies children believe. He recommends building a mental map of the child's daily world, its people and places and dangers, avoiding siding with the enemy when a child comes home wronged by a teacher or coach, translating a child's situation into adult terms to summon empathy, borrowing Faber and Maslish's image of a spouse bringing home a second lover to convey a firstborn's jealousy. He counsels against imposing solutions, illustrating with the marriage in which a husband's instant fix leaves his wife feeling more incompetent than helped, and in favor of empowering children through small real choices, recalling the finding that preschoolers make roughly 3 demands a minute, many of which cost little to honor and help a child form a sense of self. The chapter's final movement is a candid list of when emotion coaching is not appropriate, and it is here that Gottman's realism shows. Coaching should be postponed when you are pressed for time, when you have an audience, when you are too tired or angry to do it well, when serious misbehavior demands that you first state a moral limit, and when a child is faking emotion to manipulate you, illustrated by the boy who cried theatrically over a babysitter, then cracked a smile when he thought no one was watching. Gottman is emphatic that postponing is not the same as the dismissing parent's avoidance. The coach commits to returning to the feeling later and keeps the promise. He roots his optimism in a conviction he states plainly, that the natural course of human development is a positive force, that children are wired to seek love, knowledge, goodness, and the admiration of the people they love. That last claim is the quiet center of the chapter, a vision of the child as oriented, by nature toward the good, so that the parent's task is less to manufacture virtue than to protect and guide a growth that is already reaching toward it. Chapter 5. Marriage, Divorce, and Your Child's Emotional Health. Gottman widens the frame here from the parent-child dyad to the marriage that surrounds it, arguing that a child's emotional health is shaped by the quality of the intimate relationships in which he is embedded, the emotional ecology of the home. His data show that children of marriages marked by criticism, defensiveness, and contempt are more aggressive with playmates, less able to regulate themselves, and sicker with higher stress hormones. Crucially, he argues it is not divorce as such that harms children, but the hostility and failed communication that surround it, which means a bitterly intact marriage can inflict the same damage as a divorce, and that staying together for the children is no guarantee of protecting them. He assembles a sobering body of research on the long reach of marital breakdown. He draws on E. Mavis Hetherington's account of the disrupted parenting that follows separation, on Nicholas Zill's analysis of the National Survey of Children, showing that young adults of divorce are far likelier to report poor relationships with their fathers and to drop out of school, and, most arrestingly, on Howard Friedman's follow-up to Lewis Terman's decades-long study, which found that participants whose parents divorced before they were 21 died on average 4 years earlier than those whose parents stayed together, while the death of a parent in childhood had little such effect. He cites E. Mark Cummings on children's physiological distress at witnessing adult conflict, and his own laboratory observation of a 3-month-old whose competitive parents, jockeying for her attention, sent her heart racing and left her slow to recover. The buffer against all this, he argues, is emotion coaching, which he calls the only proven protection against the damaging effects of marital conflict and divorce. The chapter's most durable contribution is the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, the sequence of interactions that, in Gottman's research, reliably predict a marriage's collapse: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. He distinguishes a complaint, which targets a behavior, from criticism, which attacks character, traces how criticism curdles into contempt, the intent to wound, which he calls the most corrosive of the four, shows how contempt provokes defensiveness and how defensiveness ends in stonewalling. The shutdown he found in 85% of cases to be the husband's move, tied to men's more extreme physiological response to marital stress. For each, he offers an antidote, and he insists the same skills that repair a marriage, awareness, empathy, validation, problem-solving, are the skills of emotion coaching itself, so that becoming a better spouse and a better parent are one project. He closes with practical counsel for protecting children through conflict. Never use them as weapons or messengers, never ask them to keep secrets or take sides, let them witness resolution as well as disagreement. Build networks of other trusted adults around them, and use coaching to help them name and cope with the fear that family turmoil stirs. Underneath the practical advice runs a settled conviction that the marriage is not merely a private arrangement between two adults, but the soil in which a child's whole capacity for love takes root, and that the health of that bond is therefore among the most consequential things a parent can tend. Chapter 6. The Father's Crucial Role. Gottman opens with three fathers coming home at day's end, each with a son and a daughter, each identical on the surface, and shows how radically their evenings diverge. The first, divorced and distant, can barely sustain a phone call with a daughter whose life he no longer knows. The second, physically present but emotionally absent, brushes aside his son's eager offer to recite the 4 times table so he can talk mortgages with his wife. The third knows his children's friends, their games, their disappointments, and so is able to lend real support. The portraits set up the chapter's thesis, which Gottman states with unusual force. Children need fathers, but not just any father will do. An emotionally present, validating dad makes a distinctive contribution to his children's well-being. A harsh, critical, or cold one can do lasting harm. The claim that gives the chapter its weight is that fathers exert an outsized influence, that in his data, the quality of a father's interaction predicted a child's later success with school and friends more strongly than the mother's did, surprising precisely because mothers typically spend more time with children. He believes the reason is that the father-child relationship evokes especially powerful emotions. He builds the case through play. Fathers, he reports, engage children in more physical, exciting, roller coaster play, and it is through this rough and tumble that children learn to read cues, ride the thrill of being a little scared, and recover to calm. He cites Ross Park and Kevin McDonald's finding that children with highly physical fathers were most popular among peers, but only when the father's play was non-directive and non-coercive. Highly physical but bossy fathers produced the least popular children. This dovetails with his own finding that the fathers who scaffolded and validated raised the children who thrived, while the derogatory and intrusive fathers raised the children headed for aggression and academic trouble. Gottman places all this against the historical transformation of fatherhood, from the breadwinner model eroded since the Industrial Revolution and shattered by the economic and feminist shifts of the 1960s, through soaring divorce and out-of-wedlock birth rates, to a present in which too many children know their fathers only as the man who left or the one who owes support. He notes, with evident sympathy for the difficulty, that many men were never fathered in the way now asked of them, and he draws on Ronald Levant's work on men struggling for a definition of fatherhood that fits. His prescriptions are concrete. Get involved from pregnancy and infancy onward, when habits form and mothers can either open or close the gate to a father's involvement. Stay tuned to the everyday details rather than settling for occasional outings. Participate in the unglamorous family work of feeding and bathing and nurturing. Strike a real balance between work and home, even at some cost to career. And stay involved regardless of marital status, since 90% of fathers live apart from their children after divorce, and a father's contact, and thus his influence, tends to fade over time. The conviction animating the chapter is that a father's presence is not a substitute for a mother's, but its own irreplaceable good. That the family is a communion of distinct persons whose different gifts a child genuinely needs, and that a man who withdraws from that work leaves a gap no paycheck can fill. Chapter 7. Emotion Coaching as Your Child Grows. The final chapter carries the method across the whole developmental arc, insisting that beneath every change one constant holds: each child's desire for emotional connection with loving adults. Gottman moves through 5 stages, and the value of the chapter is in showing how the same 5 steps take different forms as a child's mind and world enlarge. In infancy, he describes the emergence of face-to-face social interaction around 3 months, the imitative games and motherese through which a baby's first experience of being understood arrives, and the baby's active competence, Edward Tronick's still-face experiment, in which infants tried an average of 4 strategies to revive an unresponsive mother before giving up, and his and Tiffany Field's work on how a depressed mother's flatness can, between 3 and 6 months, measurably alter a baby's developing nervous system. The lesson is that even here, the parent is coaching, teaching that strong feeling has an effect on the world, and that it is possible to be soothed. In the toddler years, he frames the terrible twos as the child's necessary drive toward autonomy, best met by offering small real choices and by labeling the anger and frustration that erupt over the toddler rules of ownership. If I see it, it's mine. While accepting that sharing is still developmentally meaningless. In early childhood, he locates emotional development chiefly in friendship and in fantasy play, which he treats as a door into a child's inner life, and he catalogues the age's characteristic fears of powerlessness, abandonment, the dark, bad dreams, parental conflict, and death, urging that each be met with acknowledgement rather than denial, illustrated by the Annie stories his own daughter adapted to tame her nightmares. The 2 oldest stages carry the chapter's sharpest observations. In middle childhood, Gottman describes the child's entry into a larger social world, governed by teasing and the terror of embarrassment, and makes a counterintuitive point. The child performs an emotion ectomy, learning that showing feeling among peers is a liability, and that the children who manage this best are precisely those coached to regulate emotion earlier, so that coaching produces not a child who emotes indiscriminately, but one who reads the room. He watches the same child espouse grand principles of justice while enforcing the arbitrary tyranny of a peer group's dress code, and counsels parents to let the inconsistency go as the normal work of a developing conscience. In adolescence, he casts the task as the integration of reason and emotion, and reframes the parent's role, borrowing from Michael Riera, as a demotion from manager to consultant, a trusted advisor a teenager must, in effect, choose to rehire. Drawing again on Ginot, he urges respect for privacy, acceptance rather than approval of a teen's self-defining choices, values communicated briefly rather than preached, and above all the provision of a community. The village, the congregation, the network of other trusted adults who share the family's ethics and can hold a child when he naturally distances from his parents. That final image is telling. The mature child is not raised by 2 isolated parents, but by a whole community bound together by shared convictions, and the parent's late task is less to control than to entrust. Closing reflection. Taken whole, raising an emotionally intelligent child makes a claim larger than its practical steps suggest. Gottman set out to test the intuitions of Haim Ginot and returned with evidence that the way a parent meets a child's sadness, anger, and fear reaches all the way down into the body, into heart rate and stress hormones and the developing nervous system, and all the way forward into the child's friendships, marriages, health, and character. His 5 steps are not a technique for producing compliance. They are a way of taking a child's inner life seriously, and in doing so, of forming a person capable of self-command, empathy, and love. What emerges is a portrait of the child as a genuine person with a genuine nature, oriented from the start toward connection and toward the good, whose growth a parent is called not to engineer, but to accompany, with patience, with honesty, and with limits that come from love rather than fear. The book's deepest insight may be the one it never states outright, that a child is formed not primarily by what parents intend, but by how they are present in the small, hot, unrepeatable moments when feeling overwhelms reason. Love, Gottman shows, is not enough on its own. It must be channeled into the concrete work of being there in a particular way when it counts. That work is difficult, and he is honest that it will not banish conflict or spare a family its sorrows. But it builds the one thing that lasts, a bond strong enough to carry both parent and child through everything that comes. This is a book worth reading in full, slowly, with one's own children in mind. Its pages hold far more of Gottman's specific guidance, dialogue, and evidence than any summary can convey, and the reader who takes it up will find in it not a formula but a way of seeing.